So, what I'd like to talk to you today about is the business of negative space. It's a very traditional kind of drawing exercise, and it sounds kind of paradoxical and weird. Negative space, what's that about? Well, when you think about your other drawings, especially the solid drawings that you've just done, the idea that you had to compose that second drawing, you had to put things in a certain place, and you had to draw them with not only their real dimension, light and dark, but you also had to take into consideration that they made an interesting or balanced or harmonious or sort of dynamic composition. In other words, the drawing was designed in some way. So when you're doing a drawing that's very traditional, you're still dealing with something that is the emptiness around and through the objects that you're drawing. You know, where are they placed? How much space are you going to have? How complex or simple these things are going to be. So this is an exercise that has you really focusing on the idea of what's in between and behind the objects that you are drawing. It focuses on the nothingness, what's not there, as well as what is there. So one very straightforward exercise you can do just to train your perception to be aware of that, not necessarily to do a realistic drawing, but to train your perception to be sensitive to the areas that are sort of empty, quote unquote, is doing this exercise called negative space drawing. And admittedly, as I look at this thing here, I've almost overkilled it in terms of complexity. And the good news is you're not going to be drawing all these things realistically. It's not. When you build one of your own, I'll show you. There are many more examples online that I can tell you about, and I'll do an alternative one of these that's a little bit simple. But when you put yours together, what you're dealing with is a bunch of things that are linear or planar or very thin. In other words, you don't want to block out space. If your subject is space, if your subject is the nothingness in between and among the objects, then you don't want to just have a big big volume in the center of your drawing. You want to do things that are sort of open and free in terms of where the see-through space is and the space around is. So I've chosen things here, and obviously you don't have to do exactly what I'm doing. There are many. I'll give you a list of things that are household, common objects and things that would be very useful for this. Things like vacuum cleaner hoses and chairs and gooseneck lamps, things that should be fairly easily obtained. But I've chosen these objects and placed them a little bit densely, but nonetheless with lots of black space behind them. And although I have chosen to put a couple of black boards, these black surfaces behind this setup, you obviously in your living situation don't have to do that. If you can find a blank wall, if you can find any kind of surface that has a kind of openness and a plainness about it, it makes a great backdrop for this kind of drawing. Because what you're going to be doing is, first off, with your thin woodless pencils, perhaps the number 4, the number 6, you're going to be trying to draw the contours, the outlines of these things that are in front of you. And I'll talk more about how you deal with that in terms of their overlapping and how they become flat silhouettes of things against a space. So you're drawing those things as contours first, and then eventually, as I'll show you in a sec, you're filling in the in-between spaces with your black graphite, both pencils and the crayon. The number 9 crayon is a great one. Okay, so this is a very good example of what we're talking about. It's a fairly larger piece of paper, 18 by 24, than the ones you're going to be working on. You don't have to work quite this large. But the principles are the same. What this student has done at home is that she's piled furniture, chairs, cords, stools, linear pieces of ruler or whatever, mostly stick furniture, I think, with chairs and other objects and wires, so that she's probably got a little bit more crowded composition than the one I've just shown you. But she's still got a lot of, because of the kind of object she's chosen, she's got a lot of curvilinear form. She's got a lot of sort of decorative and dynamic form. She's got a very interesting and sort of dynamic composition that's not necessarily as geometric as the one I assembled in the first instance. So this drawing, this example here, was done in class in the studio a couple semesters ago. And in that kind of space, this is a little bit of nostalgia because we don't have that kind of space to work with this semester, but in that kind of space, I was able to pile stools and easels and tables and chairs. In other words, there is the possibility of using much larger sorts of objects. Depends on your living situation, but things like mops and tables and chairs, fans. The larger the still life, in some ways, the easier it is to do. The scale does not really make it more complicated or more difficult. And what you've got here is an example of what you'd draw with your contour lines. And you'll notice that even if you do the contour lines with overlapping, you do lines that would show how a given rod or leg or form would overlap another one. If that happens, when that happens in your drawing, your contour drawing, just erase, you'll notice here, just erase the overlappings that show the individual forms and objects and their edges. And what happens is that if you just get down to the flat white silhouette of the object, okay, and that's re-emphasized by the kind of fill-in graphite blackness of the space, you end up with something I'm really fascinated with, which is you end up with a kind of abstraction. It's got this hint of being reality. You do see some aspects of reality there, but it's an amazing sort of Rorschach test kind of abstract design, a kind of patterning that if you tried to invent it yourself without a realistic still life in front of you, you'd be hard-pressed to get something this interesting. So there's something very paradoxical and interesting and sort of mysterious about the way if you pile a bunch of stuff, willy-nilly in front of you and play a game with just their contours, erase the overlapping so that you've got almost a city street, flat, no bridges, no tunnels, nothing overlapping anything else, pattern, you end up with almost a negative positive push-pull, where almost like the vase-face psychology diagram, you end up with the white coming forward as its objects, as the objects that they are, the black being the space, but also on occasion, depending on the shapes, the black coming forward as a kind of positive shape and the white becoming a space. And that kind of tension is very interesting in terms of a high contrast black and white abstraction. But I come back to the reason we're doing this, and that is that we're forcing ourselves, we're just inviting ourselves to really pay attention to the bits and pieces of nothingness, okay, that aren't there in the setup. And that if we emphasize it with the black space filled in, you end up seeing a kind of pattern that's completely unexpected and more abstract than you have in the beginning. So your first challenge in this negative space drawing is to find the subject matter, to find objects that are not necessarily the very things that you're going to draw, but they're going to help you define a kind of negative space, a kind of openness, a kind of silhouette of emptiness that I really want you to focus on. Now that sounds rather strange and weird and counterintuitive to focus on the space, but if you can find objects around your house, now I've got my own little weird assemblage of things here, but more common things around the house might be even large-scale chairs, open chairs, vacuum cleaner hoses, poles, brooms, extension cords, things that are either thin and planar toward you or things that are linear, okay? Plants, I only have one here, one solitary poor plant here, But plants are wonderful subjects for this because they give you more organic and sort of nature-oriented form, and they make more complex curvilinear form when they're put together. In fact, as I've mentioned in the text that goes along with this assignment, if you Google simply negative space drawing, there are pages and pages of examples of this, and many of them are whole greenhouses of plants that, or at least assemblage of plants that allow you more organic form. But some kind of combination of things that are sort of manufactured around the house and things that are organic make a nice combination. Your final choice does not have to be quite as complicated as this, but I would keep it so that you've got a lot of complex silhouettes of objects up against the black space, which we're going to fill in and show you about in a minute. I would not have a lot of space around the objects when you're finally drawing them. When you're doing a kind of light contour drawing, I've rubbed and scrubbed this to get myself started in this, and this is going to be my template. This is going to be my pattern around which I'll build the darker space. Now, when you're drawing all your things jumbled together, you'll want to, and there's no reason why you can't, draw them as they are overlapping one another with their outlines. In other words, in the beginning, there's no reason why you can't draw them, at least in terms of their lines, their contours, as if they are in real life and they're in front of one another, they're overlapping one another. In fact, some of the overlapping becomes wonderfully complex and challenging because you have to see the spaces through those overlappings. But if it guides you, if it helps you to draw the proportions and placement reasonably well, do the straightforward objects right away. Remember, those of you who are just starting drawing and this is all new and I'm empathetic to that, don't worry at all about shading. You're not going to be drawing the actual objects themselves. You're going to be drawing just their contours and their outlines, from which you'll sort of begin to pattern this negative space. So in the end, you're doing a pile of stuff that has lots of see-through emptiness, that you are arranging it so that things are not surrounded by a lot of space, but are sort of cropped up against the edge of the paper, okay? And it's a fairly straightforward process of filling it in that I'll do right now.